Hello everybody, and thank you for coming. I'm actually not going to talk that much about the survey that we did in Australia. We did it so long ago I don't remember very much about it at all. I will be showing you some of the results and some graphs a bit later, but I think a lot of it's been covered by speakers already. But what I'd like to do is to actually talk through some of the issues that came out of the broader survey that Paula and I did, and look at issues of authority and of definitions of history. And I'm going to use a couple of playful case studies to give you a feel for the sort of things that Australians are doing in terms of historical activities. So I've called this the House of History. I'll just see if I can make this work. Is that right? Okay. Swimming home and wild ride. On the 17th of April this year, David Watson, a 54-year-old artist and community historian who lives in the inner city suburb of Rozelle in Sydney in Australia, swam home. Here's David. This public event, which culminated in a morning tea at Cullen Park, which is a very large historical site in Rozelle, was part of a 4-year project. David, a doctoral candidate at the University of Sydney's College of Fine Arts, wrote the following about his work in a recent volume of Memory Studies. At a time of intense global flows, I had felt the need to reacquaint myself with my country. The seemingly bland, relaxed and comfortable mortgage belt municipalities of the Parramatta River corridor. Walking west from the city via Victoria Road, which is a major thoroughfare into Sydney, I immersed myself in a suburbia laced with 3 generations of my family, seeking out seams of lost and lesser-known cultural fabric. At the core of my journey lay a search for memories I felt that I should but did not possess. David's project, titled Wild Ride, R-Y-D-E, Ride being the name of the municipality in which he grew up, started in late 2006. The first half involved a 100-kilometre pilgrimage on foot, undertaken in 19 legs over 2 years, from his home in Rozelle to suburban Dundas, where he grew up. And I'll just show you that first slide again. So he's walking around, walking all around these areas, up through here and back home. During his walks, he photographically recorded suburban scenes and fragments, collected found objects and conducted archival and other research. At the halfway point of his project, he mounted an exhibition at the historic Brush Farmhouse, built around 1819, near his family home at Eastwood. The exhibition was called Walking with Cars. This comprised around 24 repurposed images, largely derived from an array of flotsam and jetsam deposited by the tide of Victoria Road and its tributaries, around which he hoped local stories could be woven. It was at this time that David proposed to swim home, 14 kilometres back to Rozelle over a week in 4 stages. The swim was documented photographically by David. That's David taking a picture of himself, and fellow artists. That one, an underwater artist, and another artist. A lot of the images captured suburbia, Sydney suburbia. Wild Ride draws on a broad range of sources and modes of presenting the past in public. These include works by 19th century artists and naturalists such as Louisa Ann Meredith, whose portrait of a Port Jackson shark in the 1850s connects the swim with one of Australia's great fears, shark attack. And also Harriet and Helena Scott, whose work on Australian bugs and their transformations were published in 1864. Archival materials such as postcards and photographs were also used. Here's the Parramatta River that David swam in around 1890, and Drummoyne Wharf around 1900. I live in Drummoyne, it's just around the corner from my house. Field work on occasions, for example, via regular swims in the famous Dawn Fraser Pool, which is near where Paula lives, which are harbour bars at Balmain, allows attention to be paid to environmental history. After commercial fishing was banned in Sydney Harbour in 2006 as a result of dangerously high dioxin levels, fish have become far more abundant in the harbour, and species are now seen in parts where they had not been seen for many years. Just as a side note, increased numbers of fish had also seen increasing numbers of sharks in the harbour because of the food source coming back in and a rise in public fears about sharks. So David's wife actually followed him in a canoe, and he had friends in a boat to just make sure if any sharks came around, he had a bit of a chance of getting away from them. David observed, David would get into the Dawn Fraser Pool and draw images of fish in the pool that he saw. Then he'd take these home and identify them. You'll see here, this one's called Steve because he couldn't identify it. But he's identified garfish, jellyfish, bream, leather jackets, whiting and other fish in this pool. While in the bars, he also observed leather jacket fish eating the algae off the wooden sideboards of this heritage pool. And they made these particular markings as they nibbled at the edge of the pool. That's what they did. So David has photographed this and a wonderful image which he's called Paintings by Fish. Environmental impacts are treated in other ways, as can be seen in this slide, entitled Lost. It combines the silhouette of an eastern whipbird with part of the exterior of a suburban house, with brickwork, wooden fences, shrubs. The eastern whipbird itself in silhouette here is a species that has been threatened by suburbanisation. Family history is another strong theme in the project, and this slide shows David in 1965 in a sandpit in his home at Dundas. That's David right on the corner on the right-hand side. It is tied in with the theme of suburbanisation, which is captured in this... it is tied in with the theme of suburbanisation, which is captured in this purposefully hazy image of the ubiquitous three-bedroom home on a quarter-acre block, which is part of the great Australian dream. This, you may say, is all very nice, but is it history? Well, David Watson thinks very passionately that it is, and so would many other people. Through archival searches, the collection of alluring crushed consumer detritus, treasures which were scanned and then enlarged, considerations of layered and eroding textures, and coming to an intimate understanding of Sydney's physical setting on the fragile fringe of a vast and ancient continent and its lived local idiosyncrasies, David Watson challenges outmoded but still lingering views of suburbia as a sterile, lifeless place. Historian Martin Thomas would agree. In his book, The Artificial Horizon, Imagining the Blue Mountains, Thomas observes that, and I quote, "To consider issues as apparently mundane as what it means to live in a particular house, on a street, on this hill or that, within a particular ecology, can, in their minutiae, provide nuanced responses to historical questions that for all of us are common ground." The late historian Greg Denning wrote of the roles of objects, such as this glass piece showing Iris, a domestic piece of glassware, which David found on one of his walks. So Greg Denning wrote of the role of objects in memory, and I quote, "I like the metaphor cargo. The relics of the past, the only ways in which the past survives, are cargo to all the present moments which follow. We all stand on the beaches of our present and make of our past, even of our past person, an object. The past is me, the past is it. All relics of the past, even if they disappear, with the note of a song or the sigh of a mime, have a double quality. They are marked with the meaning of the occasion of their origin, and they are always translated into something else for the moments they survive. Historical consciousness is always built out of that double meaning. David Watson's project, which continues to attract significant community attention and which is to end with a swim back to the place where he grew up, is perhaps one of the more creative historical projects that Australians are undertaking. It indicates very clearly the entanglement of different ways of representing the past in public and collective memory. It also demonstrates not only the strong desire for history today, but the desire of people to make their own history. This was also evident in a project that Paula Hamilton and I did through the Australian Centre for Public History with an Italian cultural organisation called COASIT. Having been approached by COASIT to work with members of its Heritage Committee on a project about Italian fruit shops, which were very prevalent in Sydney around World War II and later, and a lot of them have been destroyed by agribusiness and big chain stores. We spent 9 years working with volunteers, primary and high school history teachers, students and COASIT staff, running workshops and other events and collecting oral histories, photographs and memorabilia. This culminated in an exhibition that opened in Customs House at Circular Quay during Sydney in May 2010, which ran for 5 months and it's been travelling ever since. This is one of my honours students, Connie Donato, with her father, and her father's the little guy down there. 500 people attended the exhibition launch, which was conducted by the State Minister for Education, and literally thousands of people left comments in the numerous visitor books which built up over its first 5 months. From the outset, however, this was a collaboration. It was working with a community. Many of you will be familiar with our Australians in the Past project by now, which has been mentioned several times, which was funded by the Australian Research Council. Paula and I keep continuously saying we got $220,000 to do our survey, and we would have preferred $1 million because we could have done a lot more. But and we've been living with it for almost a decade now. While the survey was finished in 2002, it remains a reliable snapshot of Australian attitudes towards history and their historical activities. David's already dealt with this. But I'll just quickly, that's just one of the images that we collected. The little girl in the truck, this is in Waverley in Sydney in about 1924-25, and we interviewed her. She said, oh look, just wait here a minute, and wandered off and came back with this photograph which we scanned. There's the fruit shop in the background. Okay. Historical activities. Again, as David and others have pointed out, very, very similar to the American survey and to the Canadian survey, and it looks like to the Finnish survey as well. Photographs, really important. Photographs viewed, family trees, movies, TV. Very, very similar results here. Connection to the past, connections to the past, gathering with family. Christmas Day was actually identified as the most important day for reminiscing and talking about the past, which was very, very interesting. Australia Day, only about 10% of people nominated Australia Day as a day of historical importance. It's just a public holiday. It doesn't have any relationship to anything other than a bunch of English boats turning up with guns and parking in a harbour. Anzac Day is our big national day, and Christmas Day is our biggest history day, or day for connecting with the past. Medium, again, objects were very, very important, and place, which has come out time and time again in other people's presentations. Museums too seem to be incredibly trustworthy, and I think that relates, Paula and I would argue, very closely to people's sense of trustworthiness in objects, that objects don't lie to you. It also undermines a slightly naive view on what constitutes museum exhibitions as well. Finally, who nominate sources least trusty? Politicians, as in Pilvies, are right down, flat-lined. Academic historians, people thought they were very trustworthy because they got paid money and they worked in an institutional context and they had no idea what they did apart from that. Generally speaking, again, museums really big here, but interesting to see that family stories and non-fiction books are still up there relatively. And finally, who features in the narratives? Family is very, very strong, and this has significant implications for teaching at various levels, I think, which has come out in the other surveys, the family as a vehicle for actually teaching history themes and things like that. In our book, History at the Crossroads, which is available for sale in Sydney, if anyone would like to travel there. It's only 27 hours by 3 connecting flights. Paul and I got in and were totally wrecked a couple of nights ago. In our book, History at the Crossroads, Australians in the Past, Paula and I have used the metaphor of a house to describe the vast amount of historical activity in Australia, and it's just unbelievably vast. Here we said that metaphorically, history in the broadest sense might be thought of as a house with many rooms. Different groups inhabit the various quarters, including local and community historians, genealogists, specialist museum practitioners, makers of historical films and public historians. Some of these people inhabit more than one room, while many make occasional visits to other parts of the house. And all the rooms have internal divisions. Some residents, however, notably academic historians, see themselves as occupying the principal room. Indeed, not only a few from the Academy insist that they're in possession of the house. But several of the residents are a little restless, and they have been, particularly in recent years, visited by often unwanted guests in the form of politicians and ideologues, accompanied by journalists who seem hell-bent on establishing a set of rules on parts of the house while exhibiting no sign of leaving, and that's a bit of a reference to the history wars. The disjuncture between professional historical practice and people's history, or history in the everyday world, raises a raft of issues, including the role of the professional historian as advocate, the seemingly perennial question who owns the past, and the very definition of history itself. Public historian Patricia Mooney Melvin, a historian in the public history program at Loyola University in Chicago, noted with some frustration that, and I quote, even in studies such as Theodore S. Hamero's Reflections on History and Historians, with its focus on what it is like to be a professional historian as opposed to an examination of the nature of historical scholarship, the definition of historian is treated as a fixed category, unrelated to time and place. The only time and place of importance is the defining process, at least as far as the professional historical community is concerned, is that of the period when the professionalisers' construct of historian emerged and took root. Given the way in which we subject everything she wrote, everything else to reinterpretation and contextualisation, I find it curious that we are loath to examine, even at the most superficial level, the appropriateness of this definition in light of other aspects of the profession's past and present experiences. In Australia a few years ago, Bruce Skates became embroiled in a skirmish over the definition of history. In his book Return to Gallipoli, Walking the Battlefields of the Great Wars, Skates wrote of the experiences and emotions of Australian pilgrims to Gallipoli, a landscape which he notes is charged with meaning for Australians. Gallipoli is the place where the Australian nation was symbolically forged in blood and sacrifice in 1915. The history of Australian pilgrimages, he remarked in his conclusion, now spans 4 generations. 90 years on, the dead still seem to call from the graves. Families still sift through archives in search of frail memories they still wonder at the fate of men forever missing and cherished photographs, letters and medals first treasured decades ago. Today's pilgrims walk in the footsteps of those who went before them. Ageing war veterans gaze across the ground that consumed a generation. Young backpackers whisper prayers they barely remember. The nieces and nephews of long-dead soldiers gently trace their fingers across a name, their name chiselled softly in the stone. Bruce Skates's treatment of Anzac, the legend created around the 1915 warrior soldiers of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, was criticised by Mark McKenna and Stuart Ward as spilling, quote, over into sentimentality and becoming part of the myth rather than critiquing it. Skates challenged this position as academic gatekeeping based on a singular interpretation of the Anzac experience. He asserted that pilgrimages are complex journeys which equally require empathetic and engaged examinations of pilgrim testimonies as much as critical and rigorous interrogation. This, he concluded, will involve a new kind of history, one prepared to examine emotions sympathetically and respect as well as critique the deeply subjective realms of personal and collective memory. I'm going to cut this a bit short. I was going to go into a bit of a rave about Henri Lefebvre and looking at his sense of space and the lived space, the imagined space and the imaginary space, and where academic history fits into that intellectual space. And the sort of third space, we might look at the David Watsons that are challenging and integrating with that space, but I am going to run out of time, so I won't do that. I'll just... I was also going to mention Carl Becker and his 1931 address to the American Historical Association, where he talked about Mr. Everyman. People may remember that people's using the past in the present to make sense of the present and to make decisions and sense of future directions. Okay. Am I? Okay. How long do you think? Sorry. 4 minutes. I'm going to have to drop some of this, sorry. Drawing on Becker, Bernard Jensen has teased out some of the differences between usable, popular pasts and academic history. He also notes the similarities between Becker's position and the finding of Roy Rosenzweig and David Thielen in their study of how Americans connect to and use the past, that for most people, unlike the case with professional historians such as us, history and the past are not synonymous. For the majority, the past is pervasive. It is part of everyday life. Paula and I have also argued in our book, History at the Crossroads, following Raphael Samuel, that history is not the domain of academic historians and that it is a form of social knowledge that encompasses a myriad historical practices. Sorry, I'll just jump through. Echoing Patricia Mooney Melvin's remarks, Marnie Hughes Warrington, historian in Australia, reminds us that in the end we are all stylists. There is, she wrote in her book, History Goes to the Movies, Studying History on Film, quote, no history apart from historical practices, nor in consequence is there any logical, universal or unchanging reason to talk of one practice as more historical than another. If we value some historical practices over others, it is because of historical decisions, and because our views on what history is are themselves historical, they are subject to re-evaluation and change. So I think we need to address the features and functions of history and ask, as Paula did in her keynote, what is history for? Thank you very much.